Well, tonight, we begin at the end, because this time, the end tells you everything you need to know about what came before that in the courtroom today, where Donald Trump was called the orange turd repeatedly by Stormy Daniels and by his own lawyer. That's right. That's how Donald Trump's day went today. The woman he has paid more money to than any woman he hasn't married, criminal defense attorney Susan Necheles, repeatedly called her client, Donald Trump, the orange turd on what she thought was an effective cross-examination of Stormy Daniels. So imagine Donald Trump sitting in that courtroom today, slumped in his chair, leaving his eyes closed for long stretches, being forced to listen with eyes closed or eyes open to one of his criminal defense lawyers on whom he has lavished money provided by his political contributors. Listen to her repeatedly call him the orange turd. And Donald Trump is, of course, the most vain human being who has ever entered that courthouse. But his colossal vanity combined with his even more colossal stupidity leaves us unable to tell what he was experiencing. A normal person couldn't be more humiliated. Donald Trump? Was that the first time he's heard himself referred to as the orange turd? His lawyer was doing what he ordered her to do, which was keep Stormy Daniels on the witness stand as long as possible, in the Trump belief that simply minutes on the witness stand count as somehow scoring points against Stormy Daniels. The orange turd landed an hour into a belabored cross-examination by Susan Necheles that was repetitive, tedious, and almost entirely irrelevant. At 10:20 a.m., high-priced lawyer Susan Necheles said to Stormy Daniels, quote, "Isn't it a fact that you keep posting on social media how you're going to be instrumental in putting President Trump in jail? Answer, show me where I said I would be instrumental in putting President Trump in jail." Question, all right, Ms. Necheles, if we could show the witness J43, please. Question, do you recognize that as your post? Answer, yes. Question, and I don't see the word instrumental or jail. Ms. Necheles, blow it up a little bit more. Susan Necheles then shows the post on all of the screens in the courtroom for the jurors to see and for the spectators to see and for Donald Trump to see. And then she says, quote, "You were responding to the post, someone else's post there." Answer, yes. Someone calling me a human toilet. So I capitalized on the joke. Question, the other post, Michael Cohen and Stormy Daniels, a.k.a. the human toilet, are their star witnesses, right? Answer, yes. You said, exactly, making me the best person to flush the orange turd down. Answer, yes. So Susan Necheles brought the orange turd into the courtroom and kept it there. The questioning about the orange turd went on and on. Stormy Daniels said, quote, "I don't see instrumental or jail there. You're putting words in my mouth." Question, so when you said you were the best person to flush the orange turd down, you weren't saying you were going to be instrumental in causing him to be convicted of a crime? That was not what you meant? Answer, no. Question, what does that mean? Answer, I'm pretty sure this is hyperbole. If somebody calls me a toilet, I can say flush somebody. See how that works? Now, trying to explain a joke to a lawyer in court is always pointless. Question, you said you were going to flush President Trump? Answer, I didn't say President Trump. It says orange turd. So if that's what's interpreted by you, question, what do you mean? Answer, I don't know what I mean. Question, you have no idea? Answer, I'm also not a toilet, so it's all... I'm asking you whether you knew what you meant when you said an orange turd. Answer, yes, I do. Question, what did you mean? Answer, I meant I'm not a human toilet, so if they want to make fun of me, I can make fun of them. Question, you don't want to admit you meant Mr. Trump? Answer, I absolutely meant Mr. Trump. Question, why did you say no? Answer, it doesn't say instrumental and putting him in jail. And so it went with Susan Necheles repeatedly pretending to quote things that she wasn't quoting and getting caught by the witness, Stormy Daniels, who then proved that Susan Necheles had mischaracterized what she was presenting to Stormy Daniels. And Stormy Daniels did not spend 1 minute in law school learning how to do that. That is a sample of what happened in the morning. But as I said, the most important part of the day, by far, was the end. That's when Judge Juan Merchan got the last word and provided the most important possible review of Stormy Daniels' performance on the witness stand, as did the Trump lawyers. Stormy Daniels left the witness stand at 12:23 p.m., 2 hours after Susan Necheles had invited her to repeatedly call Donald Trump the orange turd to his face in the courtroom. Three more far less colorful witnesses then took the witness stand, and Judge Merchan ended testimony early today, on the early side, at 4 p.m. so that the Trump defense could have some time to raise two motions, both of which were denied by the judge. First, criminal defense attorney Todd Blanche, who's the lead defense attorney in this case, and who has already been so thoroughly humiliated in that very courtroom that he enters, exits, and spends the day at the defense table looking like the saddest man in the room every day. Todd Blanche argued a motion to the judge to rewrite his gag order on Donald Trump to now exclude Stormy Daniels from the gag order so that Donald Trump can tweet about her now or do whatever he does on Truth Social. Todd Blanche insisted now that Stormy Daniels had presented what he called a, quote, completely different version of events. Donald Trump should be free to publicly respond to that completely new version of events. The judge asked for an example of what Todd Blanche thought was a completely different version of events. Todd Blanche quoted Stormy Daniels testifying, quote, I felt the room spin in slow motion, and a few other lines, to which the judge said, I don't see a new set of facts. The district attorney argued that the additional elements of Stormy Daniels' testimony were not inconsistent with her previous statements. Judge Merchan explained why he would not change the gag order. Quote, my concern is not just with protecting Ms. Daniels or a witness who has already testified. My concern is with protecting the integrity of these proceedings as a whole. That means that everybody sees what happens. Witnesses who have not yet testified will see what happens. They will see how witnesses who have testified are going to be treated by your client. And I can't take your word for it that, no, this is going to be low key. This is not going to be an attack. This is just going to be a response to what was said, because that's just not the track record. The reason why the gag order is in place to begin with is precisely because of the nature of these attacks, the vitriol. These were very real, very threatening attacks on potential witnesses. So the track record, your client's track record, speaks for itself. I can't take your word for it that he will just say, hey, I dispute the facts. So with regard to your application for me to modify the gag order to allow your client to respond to Ms. Daniels, that application is denied. And then Judge Merchan listened to Todd Blanche's motion for a mistrial based on how devastating Stormy Daniels' testimony was to Donald Trump. Todd Blanche called Stormy Daniels' testimony about what happened in the hotel room, quote, a completely made-up encounter with Donald Trump. And Todd Blanche complained plaintively, as close to tears as any man in that room has come, to the spanking. Quote, and then questioned about President Trump spanking, being asked to be spanked during the incident. Again, how that's relevant to why we're here, especially when you weigh it and compare it to the prejudicial nature of that sort of testimony, a series of questions about rolling up a magazine and spanking him. The designated family spectator supporter, Eric Trump, didn't show up today. So there were no family members sitting with us in that courtroom listening to all the legal talk about Donald Trump being spanked by Stormy Daniels. Todd Blanche insisted that, quote, this is not a case about sex. Todd Blanche said that there should not have been any testimony at all about sex, including the moments Stormy Daniels described right before the sex. Todd Blanche quoted Stormy Daniels' testimony to the judge. She says, I went to step around. I laughed nervously, tried to make a joke out of it, and to step around to leave, even though I was moving like I was in a funhouse, like slow motion. I thought to myself, great. I put myself in this bad situation. Like, what did I do? How did I misread everything? He stood up between me and the door, not in a threatening manner. He didn't come at me. He didn't rush at me. He didn't push his hands on me or nothing like that. I said, I got to go. He said, I thought we were getting somewhere. We were talking. I thought you were serious about what you wanted if you ever want to get out of that trailer park. Now, again, this is a power description. This is an extremely prejudicial statement by a witness that was never said to. There is no evidence that that was said to AMI. There was no evidence that that was said to Mr. Cohen. There was no evidence that that had anything to do with the motive of anybody involved in this case to enter into that NDA in 2016. Prosecutor Josh Steinglass had an answer for that. Quote, Mr. Blanche says, well, she never said any of this to Michael Cohen or AMI in 2016. She didn't speak to Mr. Cohen or AMI in 2016. But you know who knew what happened in that room? Mr. Trump knew. And those details of what happened in that room, those messy details, that is motive. That was Mr. Trump's motive, to silence this woman before she could tell her story in 2016, less than a month before the election. So this is not irrelevant. Mr. Trump was aware of those details, and the fact that the testimony is prejudicial and messy, according to Mr. Blanche, that is why Mr. Trump tried so hard to prevent the American people from hearing about this. The prosecutor told the judge about additional details of the sexual encounter that Stormy Daniels revealed in her interview with the district attorney's office. The district attorney deliberately did not use those details in Stormy Daniels' testimony because the district attorney knew that the judge wanted to minimize the details of the sexual encounter in the testimony. Here is an example of what the prosecutor deliberately left out of Stormy Daniels' courtroom testimony. Quote, at one point, Ms. Daniels was asked, did you feel anything unusual? Now, the answer to that question was going to be, I felt what it felt like to feel the skin of a 60-year-old man. I was 27 years old, and that was different than anything I had ever felt before. Now, that's the kind of detail that would corroborate her account of having a sexual interaction with the defendant, but was not elicited. Your Honor sustained the objection. There are other details that I don't want to put on the record. The prosecutor said that the defense can offer evidence that nothing sexual happened in that room simply by putting Donald Trump on the witness stand where he can say anything he wants about Stormy Daniels. There is no gag order on the witness stand. Todd Blanche was outraged that Stormy Daniels testified that Donald Trump did not use a condom. The prosecutor's response to that was that Donald Trump, quote, asked a lot of questions about the testing in the adult film industry, how often the testing happens, whether performers are required to wear condoms, et cetera, questions about that. And the reason that's relevant is because it explains his decision to not wear a condom. And the fact that that testimony about him not wearing a condom comes out is because the description of the conversation that she had with Mr. Trump, again, corroborates her story. Todd Blanche asked to speak again, very briefly, after the prosecutor completed his argument. Mr. Blanche, just very briefly, the court, very briefly, Mr. Blanche, I mean, Judge, what they are saying is not true. So, for example, the people just told you that Ms. McDougal was not on the witness list. The court, I'm not going to get bogged down on that. Mr. Blanche, but Judge, the court, it's not relevant to this motion. That's why I'm saying very quickly, whether she was going to be called or not going to be called has nothing to do with this motion for a mistrial, Mr. Blanche. But it does, Your Honor. The court, no, it doesn't. I am making the ruling and I decide whether it does or it doesn't. I'm telling you it doesn't. Now, it is so difficult to convey how angrily and brusquely Judge Merchan treated Todd Blanche in that courtroom. It was something we haven't seen in that courtroom before, because Judge Juan Merchan is normally a mild-voiced, calm speaker in court who makes you lean forward to hear him, and you always do, because he is so clear. So simply raising his decibel level slightly, and the quickness and intensity of his speech slightly, as he did, has an enormous effect in that room. It is bombastic in its way. Judge Merchan plays his role in such an understated way that when he leans into anything, it lands like an explosion, as it did today. And so Judge Merchan, after ordering Todd Blanche to sit down again, launched into his decision on the mistrial, saying that he agreed that the mention of the condom should not have come out. And what he couldn't understand is why Donald Trump's high-priced criminal defense lawyer, specifically Susan Necheles, did not object. The judge said, I wished those questions hadn't been asked, and I wished those answers hadn't been given. But for the life of me, I don't know why Ms. Necheles didn't object. She had just made about 10 objections, most of which were sustained. Why on earth she wouldn't object to the mention of a condom, I don't understand. And so it went for most of the issues raised by Todd Blanche. But the crushing blow to Todd Blanche's motion and to Todd Blanche's work as a lawyer in this case came when the judge explained to him, with Donald Trump sitting there listening, that Todd Blanche lost this motion for a mistrial with the very first thing he said in this trial on the first day. Judge Merchan, Mr. Blanche, in your opening statement, your denial puts the jury in a position of having to choose who they believe. Donald Trump, who denies there was an encounter, or Stormy Daniels, who claims that there was. Although the people do not have to prove that a sexual encounter actually did occur, they do have the right to rehabilitate Ms. Daniels' credibility and to corroborate her story, which was immediately attacked on opening statements. The more specificity Ms. Daniels can provide about the encounter, the more the jury can weigh to determine whether the encounter did occur, and if so, whether they choose to credit Ms. Daniels' story. Judge Merchan pointed out that he himself objected on behalf of the Trump lawyers in instances when they failed to object. And on his own, he stopped lines of questioning. Judge Merchan explained that Stormy Daniels had explained in her interview with the district attorney that seeing the movie Bombshell made her review her own thoughts and feelings about what happened in that room with Donald Trump. The movie Bombshell was Jay Roach's brilliant film starring Charlize Theron, Nicole Kidman, Margot Robbie, John Lithgow, Allison Janney, in the horror story of Roger Ailes' sexual harassment, sexual assault, and rape of women working at Fox News while Roger Ailes was running that poisoned workplace. The judge said, quote, Ms. Daniels had watched this movie years later, and it was at that point that certain memories came back and certain explanations came back to her for her feelings. I ruled immediately that that could not come in. I felt that to inject Roger Ailes into these proceedings would be unduly prejudicial to your client, and I did so even though these feelings of the numbness of hands, the room spinning, the blacking out went unexplained. And I did that to protect your client. I disagree with your narrative that there is any new account here. I disagree that there is any change in story. What's happened is people have gone into more detail than they originally planned. And the fact that you went after her right on opening statements, attacking your claim that they never had sex. You didn't attack that there was a fabrication of business records. You didn't attack any of the other elements of the offense. You said my client denies there was ever a sexual encounter. Again, as I said before, right off the bat, that puts your client's words against Ms. Daniels' words, and that, in my mind, allows the people to do what they can to rehabilitate her and to corroborate her story. Your motion for a mistrial is denied. I will see you tomorrow at 9:30. At 9:23 a.m. today, Donald Trump was in the hallway before entering the courtroom, giving one of those 5-minute speeches of his to the cameras while ignoring every question he was asked. And he said then, quote, "I want to thank my lawyers. They've done a very good job." That was exactly 1 hour before Susan Necheles called him the orange turd. And it was 7 hours before Judge Juan Merchan crushed and humiliated Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyers. Todd Blanche said, this is not a case about sex. But Judge Merchan said that in Todd Blanche's opening statement, Todd Blanche made the mistake of making this a case about sex.